I'm here, and to be severed. 3-time UFC Ultimate Fight champion. And you're wrestling with regret.
Hey everybody, it's August, and you know what that means? It's time for Animation Month. Yes, I know it took place in April last year, but you know what? It's a floating celebration. Fans and critics alike have called wrestling a male soap opera for about 1,000 years now, but another popular descriptor is a live-action cartoon. It's not surprising then to see wrestling and wrestlers take up space in your Saturday morning lineup. This week I'm taking a special look back at the history of wrestling in cartoons. Warner Brothers, the Marvel to Hanna-Barbera's DC, the Nintendo to their Sega, the WWF to their WCW. I've been a sucker for the Warner cartoons for as long as I can remember, and it was this studio that gave audiences some of the first animated looks at wrestling. The first one being 1937's Porky the Wrestler, a Tex Avery, Chuck Jones joint. In this one, Porky hitchhikes to the big fight, or the pig fight. Kind of a spoiler there. He gets a ride from the challenger, but hijinks ensue and Porky is mistaken for the wrestler himself and thrown into the ring with the champion. Well, this was Porky Pig before the lap band surgery, so I understand the confusion.
Who's that jumping out the sky? R.E.Y. Mysterio.
After a game of choo-choo, which somehow turns the entire arena into a train as well because cartoons, Porky falls backwards into a title victory, and none of the fans complained he was being shoved down their throats. Looney Tunes' second and perhaps more famous wrestling offering was 1951's Bunny Hugged, starring everyone's favorite cross-dressing rabbit. Here Bugs Bunny is the mascot for Ravishing Ronald, an amalgamation of guys like Gorgeous George and Ricky Starr. When Double R gets his ass handed to him by the Crusher, seen here doing his best Scott Steiner impression, Bugs takes over and implements his wacky ways to topple the champion. Phew, dodged a bullet there. 2 Warner Brothers cartoons and not one racially insensitive joke among them. While pro wrestling has often been referred to as a dance, Mr. Magoo took that to its illogical extreme in Hotsy Footsie, as the nearsighted one gets lost during a night of dancing and ends up in the ring, and of course is able to completely avoid destruction thanks to his sweet dance moves. Also, I'm pretty sure everyone in this cartoon is piss drunk.
Ooh, the tango, the tango. Good old Magoo. Loaded.
We fast forward several decades to Alvin and the Chipmunks, featuring the hilarious antics of the Chipmunks and their father figure Dave Seville. The episode we're talking about today is Mr. Fabulous from season 1 in 1983. By the way, all these one-off wrestling episodes almost exclusively take place in a show's first season. Must be a law somewhere. The monks, desperate to earn some extra money, sign up to wrestle around with someone who they think will be a breeze, but they end up walking away from the ad at a very inconvenient time. Yes, the Chipmunks bit off more than they could chew here, and considering Theodore's the one being put up to wrestle, it's a pretty big bite. Luckily, Alvin is the moral fiber of Zach Morris and knows how they can help his brother survive.
You can rig up a super suit for Theodore to wear in the match.
Okay, sure Alvin, a super suit. Yeah, that's fine. It makes all the sense in the... Well, there you go. Ren and Stimpy. It was a cartoon that was great, then was ruined once John Kay regained control of it years later on Spike TV. But in the beginning, there was Mad Dog Hoek, where our boys play the mismatched opponents of the Lout brothers. Kayfabe is thrown out the window early on when Ren explains to Stimpy that it's all pretend, only for the two of them to suffer a beatdown that stretches the boundaries of physical humor and animation. The business dies a little more when the big guys throw the match in favor of Ren and Stimpy. After the match that introduced the world with the flying butt pliers, we get to hear some pretty hilarious promos.
This is war! We are generals! You are the enemy!
I like Darren! He is my friend! I like his autograph! It is a nice picture!
Was that promo transcribed from the speech of my 4-year-old? Sorry, I could never stand Rugrats when I was a kid. You know, I just couldn't stand all the baby talk and the music that sounded like a Casio keyboard belching the alphabet.
Clean out the billfold. That's it. Yeah.
Must carry on. In Wrestling Grandpa, we discover that Grandpa Lou used to be known as Pretzel Maker Pickles back in his day. The old man's coming out of retirement for one last match against his old rival for the Seniors Division crown. The babies think he's a superhero, so they try to come up with ways to help him gain strength, from light to food, and even storming the ring themselves. This must have been what Vince Russo saw in his head when he was working for WCW. Of course, the wrestling itself in this episode is about as kid-friendly as you can get. The bad guy's most dastardly moves when he tickles Grandpa's foot. Snitsky would be proud. For fans of a certain age, the Disney afternoon was a staple of childhood. One of its cornerstones was Goof Troop, a show that answered more questions than we ever had about the familial circumstances of our favorite cartoon characters. In The Incredible Bulk, the local wrestling champion, Bulk Brogan, obviously not a reference to anyone who exists, issues a challenge to anyone who can hang with him for 3 minutes. Having bragged to his family about his wrestling prowess, Pete signs up but ultimately chickens out and puts Goofy's name on the application.
Now you got everything on here but your name. You forget it or something?
It's Goofy. G-O-O-V.
Goofy immediately wants to help once Pete tricks him into thinking he's signed up for an eating contest. Once he's in the ring, Goof discovers that the Bulk is actually his good friend Myron, who wants somebody to legitimately beat him so he can retire from the business and go peacefully live out his days running his restaurant, joining Jerry Lawler, Killer Khan, and Abdul the Butcher as wrestlers turned restaurateurs. The two neighbors ultimately team together to beat Myron using the powers of friendship and food. Moving into the more modern age, shows like Steven Universe have had fun with wrestling as a framing device. In Tiger Millionaire from Season 1... See? Steven discovers that the shape-shifting Amethyst, one of the gems, moonlights as a professional wrestler named the Purple Puma. To help her out, Steven adopts the eponymous gimmick, a hybrid of IRS and the $1 Million Man, with some Paulie Dangerously and Jim Cornette thrown in for good measure.
Tiger and Puma have won the championship and saved wrestling.
Lars, I'm really confused.
Yeah, well, it's wrestling, so... The show takes on this topic again a few seasons later in Tiger Philanthropist. Here, Amethyst retires from competition, but Steven, not wanting to disappoint his fan base, decides to update his gimmick to that of the charitable babyface philanthropist. However, this character change upsets Lars, his biggest fan.
Honestly, it's such a weird angle, you know? The whole thing just felt so off. It's like the sequel no one asked for.
This is why we can't have nice things in wrestling. In the end, Tiger and Puma team up one last time to put over the good-looking gang and walk away from the wrestling world for good. Wait, what did I just call it?
For wrestling!
Quite possibly the most infamous wrestling-themed episode of a cartoon ever, South Park's WTF is one that stood the test of time. The episode begins with the boys catching a live WWE event, then wanting to become wrestlers themselves. When they find the traditional kind of wrestling to be too homoerotic, they do their own thing in the backyard, using evil foreign heels, a Vietnam War veteran, and a girl who's had more than a dozen abortions before the age of 10. Their show soon becomes a huge deal, and Vince McMahon himself even takes an interest in what the boys are doing.
They are decent wrestlers. We'll see how they develop their through lines in the second act.
I can vividly recall some fans being disappointed and even upset over how this episode turned out. Some people wanted the show to take its trademark skewering of pop culture and politics and use that against Vince McMahon and WWE for how they've killed the wrestling business over the years. Sounds great, but the only problem is no one outside the wrestling fan base actually gives a shit about any of that. Instead, the show barely talked about WWE at all, focusing less on the wrestling part of wrestling and more on the theatrics. They turned the whole thing into a literal interpretation of the phrase, wrestling is theater, from the dramatic monologues, a musical number, and even proscenium staging in the backyard. In fact, as the episode ends with the boys getting into a real fight, the throngs of fans tune out because it's too boring and looks contrived. South Park shows that they get wrestling way more than some wrestling fans do. The Simpsons, a show that's been around longer than a good chunk of my audience, it's still alive and kicking today. I tuned out of the show eons ago, but apparently back in season 24, we were given Gorgeous Grandpa. As part of the show's continuing effort to retcon their universe a few times over, we discovered that Abe Simpson once wrestled as Gorgeous Godfrey, a plot that's an obvious ripoff of a certain Nickelodeon show. But Abe walked away from the business when he could no longer bear being a detested heel. Mr. Burns, a Godfrey superfan, convinces Grandpa to get back into the ring and resume his evil ways. But Abe has a change of heart after seeing how Bart wants to follow in his footsteps and becomes Honest Abe as a result. For a show that's been around as long as it has, it's remarkable that The Simpsons waited this long to take a shot at wrestling, and I think they did a pretty good job at it.
If professional wrestling were fake, that would make every fan in the history of the sport a complete and utter moron.
But of course, this is not the first time wrestling was actually featured on The Simpsons, as we saw in Bret Hart's memorable cameo appearance in Season 8's The Old Man and the Lisa.
Ooh, this place has got old man stink.
Which brings me to the next chapter in this episode, Wrestlers in Cartoons. One of the earliest and most iconic uses of a wrestler in animated form has to be that of Sergeant Slaughter, who managed to get himself a recurring role on G.I. Joe.
Come on, you guys! I could use a little help!
But becoming the first real-life G.I. Joe in history had its consequences, as Slaughter was forced to leave the WWF in order to pursue the deal. This is because G.I. Joe's action figure line was through Hasbro, while the WWF had their toys made by LJN. Slaughter would eventually return to work for McMahon in 1990, where he'd take on his most high-profile role, becoming WWF champion as an Iraqi sympathizer. Well, it was either that or Cobra. Speaking of white-hot storylines, in the late 90s, no one in wrestling was bigger than Stone Cold Steve Austin. Meanwhile, MTV had a hit on their hands with Celebrity Deathmatch, a show that used clay animation to depict poorly voiced celebrities beating each other to a gruesome death. Like the Rock and Wrestling connection back in the 80s, the mutual fan base of MTV and the WWF was a match made in heaven for the time period. The partnership led to the Rattlesnake appearing on Deathmatch a number of times, mostly as a color analyst of all things. But in the show's first season, fans actually got to witness Austin vs. McMahon a full 6 months before the real thing at St. Valentine's Day Massacre.
Oh, there you go, Fitch. Here's a little mental acumen for you.
The Bionic Redneck would later appear on an episode of Season 2 of the cult favorite Dilbert on UPN, where he was the judge in a custody trial between a pregnant Dilbert and, well...
Aliens, robots, cows, hillbillies, a billionaire, and 17 engineers.
Yep, a giant Stone Cold is probably the most normal thing about this episode. Back to some more kid-friendly fare, the first season of Kim Possible featured an episode entitled Pain King vs. Cleopatra, which featured the vocal talents of Test and Goldberg. Even if you try not to think too hard about how weird of a pairing that is, what's even more interesting is that while Test was signed with WWE at the time in 2002, Goldberg was nowhere near the company yet. Also, a tip of the cap for them keeping kayfabe in this scene.
You're taking a vacation this year.
Yeah, we went ahead and rented a cottage out of Martha's Vineyard.
I hate your guts! I'm taking you down!
Since his retirement, Ric Flair has appeared on multiple platforms, selling lottery scratchets, protein shots, rap music, etc. But the Nature Boys also tried his hand at voice acting. Aside from his role in Camp WWE, which we'll talk about later this month, Flair made a guest appearance on The Cleveland Show as himself.
Let me tell you, there are 3 things I know: divorce, wrestling, and enduring male friendship. Woo!
Also, here's a completely necessary appearance on an episode of Uncle Grandpa that I'm sure he was paid a lot of money to do.
I'm telling you, that match was nuts.
Yes, it was.
You know, I feel like Flair had a run of bad luck going up against Hulk Hogan. He lost almost every match they were in together, and when it comes to doing voice work for a Seth MacFarlane cartoon, he ended up picking the one that got canceled. The Hulkster appeared as himself in Season 7 of American Dad, an episode called Stanny Tendergrass. In it, Stan's finally able to join a country club he's been wanting to be a part of for 30 years after selling out club employees and having their swim time taken away. It's up to the Hulkster to finally talk some sense into Stan.
What you gonna do when Hulkamania runs wild on you?
Stan's able to get the club employees their swim time back as Hogan literally walks off into the sunset. Keep your damn clothes on, please, Hulk.
What's Hitler gonna do when these 20-forest pythons come for you? Hogan!
But my pick for favorite Hogan voiceover has to be his appearance on Robot Chicken as the leader of a different kind of Hogan's Heroes, where Hogan and his band of wrestler friends cause chaos for Colonel Klink and Hitler. Roddy Piper also appears in the skit as himself and is able to steal the show.
Roddy, we need your stealth, and the rest of us will sneak past.
Gotcha, Hogan. Hey, you f***ing Nazi! How are you? Sprats, please!
And now, as it seems to happen occasionally in my reviews, let's just close this one out with a barrage of Randy Savage highlights. Of all the wrestlers out there, the Macho Man's probably the king of voice work. Whether he's been the main feature, a cameo, or uncredited, there's no escaping that distinct voice of his. Some of his smaller bit roles included that of Gorilla on an episode of King of the Hill, Master Sergeant Emily Dickinson in Duck Dodgers, and as the car El Machismo in the cartoon-adjacent Cars video game.
I know it's a good workout when blood vessels in the back of my eyeballs pop.
Here in the 24th and 1/2 century, we are unencumbered by gender-based names. And my mama happens to be a fan of romantic poetry.
Little machismo is on it. I am the greatest.
And in case you're wondering, Savage wasn't the only member of the Mega Powers to lend his voice to a vaguely Spanish-sounding character in a video game.
You're ready to face Killbane, but the luchadors must still be dealt with. You know where to find me if you need more training.
But above all else Macho Man did as a voice actor, two roles stand out the most. First, there was his role in Space Ghost Coast to Coast as Leonard Ghostal, the grandfather of the title character, full of whimsical stories and old man musings as he interviews a young Raven Simone.
Have you met Haystack Calhoun? He was a mountain of a man. I sent him home to mommy with a rolling DDT. Show him your awesome deltoids, Tadville.
Did my pinky back and
Don't you raise a hand to me, Missy. I'll put you in a figure 4 leg lock.
Then there's Dial M for Monkey, which aired as a recurring segment primarily on the first season of Dexter's Lab. In this segment, Dexter's Lab Monkey lived a double life as a superhero taking on fantastic villains. For wrestling fans, the most famous of these has to be when Monkey has to save planet Earth against the Wrestler, an intergalactic wrestler and destroyer of worlds voiced by Mach himself.
Well, I am America, mister. Well, here's my John Hancock. I do not like your kick so high. I do not like it, Samurai. Next.
The Wrestler easily takes down our hero and declares that Earth is the next planet to go, but Monkey channels the spirit of John Cena and never gives up. Seeing this act of a courageous spirit, Wrestler decides to spare the planet, as any place that could spawn a creature with such resolve is truly worthy. Anyone could have done the voice of the Wrestler in this cartoon, but just by being himself, Randy Savage made the role his own and made the cartoon iconic to viewers everywhere. That's going to do it for this one, fans. Check back over the next few weeks as I review more entries for Animation Month. Be sure to thumbs up this video if you like it, comment below, subscribe to Wrestling with Regret, and buy the t-shirts at ProWrestlingTees.com. I'm Brian Zane, and I'll see you next time.